The date is November 2nd, 1997. The survivor is Christine Month. Last name at birth, Margulies. Interviewer is Mark Shimsky. The city and state is Stony Brook, New York. The country, the United States of America. The language, English. Today's date is November 2nd, 1997. I am interviewing Christine Month. My name is Mark Shimsky. We are conducting the interview in Stony Brook, New York, in the United States of America, and the language we are using is English. If I happen to... Hi.
Hi.
Would you spell your first and last name, please?
Christine, Christine, Month, Month.
What was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Krysia, that was my first name, my Polish name, and Margulies was my last name.
Could you spell that first?
Krysia was Krysia, and Margulies was Margulies.
Did you ever have any other names?
Later, when we went to France, I acquired a French name, and then when we came to Montreal in 1949, I had an English name.
And what was your French name?
French name was Christine, spelled Christine, which easily translated into Christine, same spelling in English.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever go by any nicknames?
At home, I was called Krysia, and my best friends would sometimes use that nickname. And my relatives called me Krysia.
Christine, what is your birth date?
January 17th, 1937.
And what is your age today?
I'm 60 years old.
In what city and what country were you born?
I was born in Krakow, in Poland, in 1937.
What were your maternal grandparents' names?
Hirsch, in Polish, Heshu was my grandfather, and Leah was my grandmother.
Do you remember them?
My grandmother, I'm not even sure that I knew. She left for Palestine, I believe, before I was born. I never saw her. I think she died during the Second World War, or maybe even before, in Palestine. My mother's father, I remember somewhat, but I don't know if these would be pictures that I saw of him. I don't think so, because I don't seem to have any, and I don't remember my mother having any. So perhaps I do remember what he looked like. I remember a beard, and he was an Orthodox Jew. What do you call those?
Pays?
Pays, right. And I did visit him, I'm sure, and maybe even lived part of the time in a small town called Dąbrowa, where he lived. So I probably did see him. To say that I actually remember him would not be true.
I'm sorry, could you just spell Dąbrowa?
Dąbrowa, Dombrowwa, a small town probably on the outskirts of Krakow.
And this is where your maternal grandfather lived?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And you said you went to visit him?
Yes.
And he had a beard?
He had a beard,
yes.
And pace.
Do you remember what language he spoke?
I don't remember him speaking to me, but I know that he must have spoken Polish and, of course, Jewish. But he did speak Polish.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Erna. That was maybe more of a nickname. Her actual given name at birth was Esther. But Erna was her Polish name, and that's the way she was called.
Do you know when and where she was born?
She was born in that part of Poland, which was then Austria. And I believe she was born in, I think, 1904. And in 1904, where she was born was Austria. She was born in Austria. Now, I don't know, if that was Poland later or before, or how, Poland was divided more times than probably any other country.
What languages did your mother speak?
My mother spoke Polish. That was the main language she spoke. She spoke Jewish, of course, at home. And later, when we moved to Paris, she learned French. And when we moved to Canada, she learned English, so she spoke that. She probably understood some German, but her main language was Polish.
Do you have many memories of when you were a very young girl?
What age are we talking about?
From the time you were maybe 3 years old until...
From the time I was 3 years old. I was born in 1937. The war broke out in 1939. I would have been 2. I can't say really that I remember anything. I have, maybe a picture or 2 of myself, maybe at age 2, and I see myself somewhere possibly in the country, and I look at myself, but I can't say that I remember what I'm wearing. Some little stories were told to me later, like in one of the pictures I'm wearing a hat because my mother was embarrassed that I had no hair, so it's in the middle of the summer, but I'm wearing a hat, that kind of thing.
What's your earliest memory of your mother?
My earliest memory of my mother. I would have to say that that was really maybe before I was in hiding, but certainly there are some memories of my mother when I was in hiding. I know a story about my mother before we were hidden, and I can't tell you that I remember that firsthand. In other words, this may be something that was told to me after. Do you want to hear the story?
Sure, let's hear it.
We were on a train somewhere, my mother and I, before we were in hiding, so it was before 42, 43. And the train was filled with German soldiers. And my mother and I were sitting on this train, and I was a little girl. In 42, I would have been 5. I was maybe 4, maybe even younger. And I took my mother's purse to play with it. And I started taking articles out of the purse. And we were sitting on this train, and next to us, standing and sitting, were young German soldiers. And maybe I was trying to talk to them, attract their attention a little bit, as a little girl might. And then I removed from my mother's purse a few items, and one of them was a photograph of her with the armband. And it was a tricky moment, which, I was told later. I don't think I understood it then. At least 1 or 2 of these German soldiers saw that photograph because that was my intention, to show off and to show it to them. But no comments were exchanged. It was as though that had not been seen by them, and we just carried on. So that is a memory of my mother, either telling me something or actually maybe even somehow picturing her on that train and probably going through a difficult time, wondering what, was going to happen as a result.
Can you describe your mother to us at that time? What did she look like?
She was dark-haired. She was sort of slim. I do remember a very positive kind of person, happy most of the time. I don't remember her depressed, even in the harshest of times when I was in contact with her during the war. Very sort of family-oriented, telling me about my aunts. There was an aunt who was an editor of a little poetry journal, and my mother was sort of very proud of that and would read me some of these little poems. More or less, something like that.
Do you know what level of education she attained?
My mother came from an Orthodox family. I don't believe she went, perhaps Hebrew schools. I don't know what would have, been her schooling then. Maybe a regular sort of Polish elementary school. I never found that out. I don't know that. I know that schooling, and that kind of education was not for daughters of Orthodox Jews. So she must have been, educated either at home or, I don't know. I don't know what schooling she had. She was certainly a very intelligent and bright, person. But
Do you recall if she? Do you recall that she had an occupation when you were very young? Was she working somewhere?
she was not working.
Mm-hmm.
I do recall something that she always was very proud of. She thought she was a bit of a rebel, and she loved music, and she loved concerts, and she loved shows, but she was not allowed to go to these as the daughter of an Orthodox man. However, she did tell me that she somewhat rebelled at home and managed to go to the opera and to go to the concerts, and somehow she found her way there, and
She snuck off, huh?
yes, that kind of thing, exactly.
Yeah.
She was very musical all along.
Did she play an instrument?
She did not herself, although she very much wanted me to, and I did have lessons, but she sang. She sang quite beautifully, and in fact, close to the end of her life, when she was already ill and in a nursing home, she and I made a tape together of songs that she knew: Polish, French, English, and she sings along with me, and it's one of my treasured possessions.
Do you recall her singing lullabies or songs to you when
I
you were a little
recall
girl?
her singing Always There in the Background, and
Uh-huh.
in fact, when we moved to Canada and I became, a 60s rock and roll person, she loved Bob Dylan, she liked the Beatles, maybe not the Rolling Stones, I can't remember.
Do you remember any of these songs right now? Can you sing them?
That my mother sang?
Yeah.
Here. Well, a few of the Jewish songs. I never learned Jewish, but the tunes, la 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 la. That was the song she sang. She sang a number of other, Jewish songs. The Polish anthem was something that we sang together, when she was already ill in the nursing home. But she was always there humming and singing.
Which ones do you remember?
You mean that my mother sang,
Yeah.
let's say?
To you?
To
With
me?
you?
I can't say that I remember them, from when I was an infant. I remember them more, later on when we made that tape together, when she was ill. I don't remember her singing lullabies to me, no. I don't remember that. I think, when I was very young, too, let's say, before the war broke out, I wouldn't remember them. And during the war, I don't think my mother sang me lullabies.
Do you remember your paternal grandparents, Christine?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. I really don't know if I knew them. I know their names, and my father often spoke about his father, and our oldest son, Steven, is named for him, so we heard a lot about him, but I don't know nearly as much, familial lore about my father's parents as I do about my mother's.
What were their names?
Shlomo was my father's name, and Rebecca was my grandmother. Shlomo Margulies, Rebecca was Grossbard.
And what were you told about them?
There's a big gap there, right? I know so much more about my mother's father.
Did your father's father have an occupation?
Probably, but I don't really know what it was. And I don't know whether those grandparents, I imagine they perished during the war, but I'm not certain. I know my father's siblings, he had 3 sisters and 1 brother, and they were all killed in the Holocaust. He's the only one who survived. And his parents, of course, I never knew after the war. I may have met them. I do remember being told that I met at least one of my father's sisters, and that sister's little girl, who was maybe just a year older than I. During the war, my mother and I went there. She lived in a town called Przemyśl, and we did spend some time there before we went into hiding. That was one of my father's sisters, and her little girl.
And did they perish in the Holocaust?
They all perished in
Yes,
the
they did.
Holocaust. His 3 sisters, 1 brother, all their children except the brothers, my uncle's son, Ray, survived the Holocaust in England, but his parents died. So all my father's siblings perished.
Tell me about your father. What was his name?
My father's Leon Margulies. What I remember when I was very little, and again, I think maybe I was told that later, was that my father, who loved sweets, all kinds of chocolate and sugar and pastries, loved to feed me that, and that I loved it, and that my mother did not love the fact that my father gave it to me. I think she thought that if I never find out what chocolate is, I would never crave it or want it, but my father made sure that I did, and to this day, I don't know if I thank him for it or... When I was very little, after the war broke out, I think my father, as a lot of the men at that time did, went east. But where exactly he went and how long he was away from us, absent from us, I'm not sure. Eventually he came back and we all went into hiding. But during those couple of years, he was not with us. I know that my mother was in touch with him because there's a photograph that she had taken of me at a photographer's that she sent to him. So he was, he wasn't, he wasn't there in the beginning. Later on, when we were hiding, I did see my father occasionally. I would be brought to the place where he was hidden for short periods of time. He could not leave the place where he was because he had, I guess, what you call the Jewish look, maybe a Jewish nose or whatever. So if he, if he was seen on the street, it was too much of a risk. My mother did leave, and she would come to visit me and actually to take me from the place where I was in hiding and bring me to the apartment that we owned before the Germans took Krakow over. And that apartment was given to a German, I think he was a postal inspector of some kind. He had a high position. And my mother and he somehow struck some kind of a friendship. First he asked her if she would work for him, and she, maybe in her naivete and her rebelliousness, said she doesn't work for anybody. He was a German. That could have been, that was sort of risky. But he did make that apartment available over the weekends, and my mother would come and pick me up and the daughter of the woman who saved me, the daughter's name was Gabby, she was my age. My mother would take us to this apartment and give us baths, and because I don't think there was, where I was in hiding, the house was not as well equipped as this apartment that we had owned. And I know that she used to sew quite beautifully, and she would make lovely outfits for me and for this Gabby, and a lot of that was done when she would take us to this place. So she actually did leave her hiding place, took a chance, and came. And so I did spend some time in those 3 years that I was in hiding with her, not as much with my father.
I'd like to go back to your father
Sure.
for a moment, Christine. You said something about him going east. Now, what exactly did that mean to you?
That, I think, meant to what was Russia. Now, to me, at that time, it could not have meant anything. I was 2, I was 3. The only thing it may have meant to me, and I can't say that I really remember it exactly, is that my father wasn't always there, whereas my mother was there more. So even before we went into hiding, I was with my mother either in Dombrova, I was with my mother in Przemyśl, because I think my mother was perhaps trying to find a place for us to live, to be.
Well, I know the Germans came into Krakow in 1939,
Right.
September of 1939,
Right.
actually. So you must have been
I was 2 years
2
old.
years old.
Right.
Okay. And your mother was taking you around to
Yes.
various places, and your
Right.
father went east.
And my father had gone east. Now, I don't know if he went in 1940, if he went in 1939. I don't think he went in 1939. It must have been a little later than that.
What did your father do for a living?
Okay, my mother's father had a silver works factory right in the center of Krakow, where they made cutlery and sort of lovely objects out of silver. And he employed quite a number of workers. I think most of them were Gentile workers. And my father, first, I think by the time my father married my mother, my grandfather had sort of retired, and he gave the business over to my father and to my mother's brother, one of my grandfather's sons. So my father and this uncle of mine ran the business.
This was a large business?
It was quite a large business, I believe, for, that time and that place.
And it was in Krakow?
It was right in Krakow, right, on a street called Dietla.
Could you spell that?
Dietla. And this turned out, this must have been, I don't remember it, but one of the larger streets in Krakow, because where I was hidden and where I was saved during the war, and where Gabby, who was, the daughter of the woman who saved me, she lived on that street, and she still lives there. So there are, at least 2 things that I know about that street: my grandfather's business and the place where this Gabby lived, and where I was hidden during the war.
Do you know if the place still exists?
The place does still exist, because Gabby, who eventually, well, that's sort of later in the story, came to Montreal, having been sponsored by my father, brought us a picture of what that building looks like. I must have it somewhere. It's not one of the pictures I have, readily available, of what the address on Dietla, where my grandfather's factory was, looks like now. That building is still there.
Where was your father born?
My father was born in Tarnów, in Poland.
And do you know when he was born?
Okay, he died in 96, he was 94, so he was born in 1902. Right, my mother was born in 1904, he was born in 1902.
And do you know what kind of education he received?
He did have some schooling. I guess it was high school, what the equivalent of high school was at that time.
Were you ever told about how or when your parents met each other?
Oh, there is a story I don't, which I heard really more recently after my father died. My mother, besides being a little rebellious, I think was a little bit, or considered herself a little bit of a business person. I mean, she had been maybe around my grandfather's business. And when she realized that her father was going to retire and was giving, the business to his son, my mother's brother, she asked, she told my grandfather that she wanted to be in the business. And he said, if you meet a fine religious Jew, then he can get the business. And apparently my parents were, what is that called, matched, the matchmaker type. My grandfather wanted to find someone for my mother that he would consider, religious and fine and so on. I don't know quite how this went, but when my parents met, supposedly for the first time, my parents already knew each other. So in other words, my mother presented this man, but she already had known this man. And so I guess that's how they met. What, their romance was like and so on, I don't know.
So your father then must have been a religious man.
My father came from a religious family, yes. Yes, not probably quite as religious as my grandfather was, but enough to get the business.
I know you were very young at the time, but I was just curious, do you happen to know, or were you ever told, that they were members of either your mother's family or your father's family that held positions of leadership within the community, either in business or medicine or religion?
You mean at the time?
Yes.
At the time, I don't remember being told that. And again, I know that my grandfather was, I guess, somehow renowned, and I know that, he was learned in the Talmud and the Torah, and, I'm sure he gave to charity, etc. And I had this aunt who was, an editor and maybe a little bit of a poet herself. But these things I heard after. Mm-hmm. They were not things that I knew during the war, that I was told then, no.
You said that you lived with your parents initially in an apartment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did anyone else live with you in your home?
No.
No. We're going to be stopping here, Christine. We'll start again soon. Thank you.
Okay.
This is tape 2, and I'm interviewing Christine Month. Christine, we were talking about your family. You were a very young girl, only 2 or 3 years old, when the war reached Krakow. And you were telling me about your home. Were you an only child?
Well, there's a bit of a story there. I was an only child, but in 1939, my mother gave birth to a stillborn little girl. I learned that later. I don't think I realized it at the time it was happening. I don't remember my mother pregnant, nothing like that. I believe it was a full-term baby, but only recently did I realize that I'm not certain of that. And I do remember things that my mother told me. Perhaps it was after the war that she told me, or that I overheard her maybe tell others. The Germans were already occupying Krakow, and she went to a hospital. And I remember her telling me that she was delivering over some porcelain basin, and she remembers the basin breaking under her. I don't think she implied that that caused the stillbirth. When I thought of it afterwards, and I don't know, again, I don't know if she meant for me to know it or if it really actually happened. It was always said that in a way it was a blessing because with a newborn in 39, it was not likely that either all three of us, all four of us would have survived or that this baby would have survived. So in a way it was perhaps how can you say lucky, but something like that. And then again, there were other hints that I got that perhaps, and I don't want to say this, I'm not sure of it, but that maybe she did something to bring about a stillbirth, which again would suggest that she realized, what was happening and maybe didn't want this baby to be alive. But I really never confronted her with that. She never specified that. I do remember the other, that it was a bit of a blessing that this had happened, but perhaps it just happened. So.
To whom in your family would you say you were the closest?
During the war, you mean, or before?
Yes.
My mother had a younger sister. Her name was Marta, and she, of all the sisters, I think was the only one who was living in Krakow at the time that I was born. And I remember being told that I was very, very fond of this aunt. My mother was the sixth of 7 girls first born to my grandmother, after which 2 boys were born. And so my mother was the second youngest girl, and then Marta was the youngest, and then finally 2 boys were born. But some of the older sisters did not live in Krakow, and in fact 2 of them and one of my mother's brothers had gone to Palestine probably in the early 30s, and their mother had gone to Palestine. So I did not know those aunts at all.
While you were growing up, Christine, what language do you remember speaking at home?
Polish.
Polish.
That was the language I spoke, yes.
Do you remember hearing any Yiddish?
I remember hearing a lot of Yiddish, but later on. What I remember in Poland, I can't say, because once we were in hiding, there was no more Yiddish. So certainly from 42, 43, I did not hear it. My parents did not speak Yiddish to me. They spoke Polish to me. And with a grandfather or any of my aunts, it would have been Polish that I spoke.
This apartment that you said your family lived in, do you remember it? Can you describe it?
I remember the address. It was number 2, Bonerowska. It was, I believe for the time, rather a nice apartment. I think it was on the bottom floor of a building that maybe had 6 or 8 apartments. I do remember it a little, but I think I remember it more after the war because we did go back there in 1945. I remember having a little girlfriend, not, living either in the same building or close by. The layout of the house, perhaps just a little bit. I remember there was one of these stoves, sort of like a porcelain stove, where you used to, if you stood next to it, you could kind of heat yourself. And perhaps it was also used for baking and so on, something like that. There was one of these. It was a nice apartment. I was told, this I don't remember, that I had a lovely room, and I think there were somebody hand-painted all kinds of animals, insects, little storybook characters in that room, and that I this my mother told me after, I don't remember, that I liked to be in that room, and I kind of occupied myself there.
Do you remember any favorite toys or games or activities that you participated in while you were a very young girl at that time?
Not before the war,
Mhm.
and during the war, again, I don't remember all that much, although when Gabby, who, was the woman who saved me, her daughter, came in 1994, she filled me in on some of these things, and she told me that I like to recite little poems that I had memorized or someone taught me, that we had some doll whose hand was broken. Or she would say to me, "Do you remember this doll we had?" I did not remember. She did remind me that we played hopscotch and that we used to draw with a stick in the dirt, sort of. And that actually sort of activated a bit of a memory. I remembered what that hopscotch pattern looked like. And I remember right after the war that I had a doll, and I remember the dolls, I named her Ursula, and I remember what she looked like. And I remember my mother sewing lovely clothes for this doll. And in fact, I remember one little dress that she made for the doll, and I remember the material she used was from an old blouse of hers, so she ripped this blouse and made a little dress for the doll. But that was, I was already, it was 45, so I was 8.
What did you like to eat when you were a young girl? Do you remember that?
Oh, I think that was, talk about Jewish mothers. They were, I think my parents were worried that I didn't eat enough, that I did not especially love food. I don't remember that. But I do remember a story that my mother told later on, that when we went to Przemysl to visit this aunt of mine, this my father's sister, who had a little girl, her name was Ruth, who was, I think, maybe a year older than I was. And I think a big concern of the parents in those days was to get children to eat. And I don't think I was a huge eater, but I ate fine. But this girl really did not like to eat. And apparently she taught me how to stop our parents from bugging us about eating. She taught me how to vomit. You put your finger in your mouth and you vomit, then they don't make you eat anymore. So I apparently was taught that and learned that. I don't know if I ever used it. I just remember being told that later on.
Do you recall any particular foods that your mother made for you? Any special foods? I know you like chocolate.
Yeah. That she made me before the war, I couldn't tell you. Yeah. After, I became a fairly good eater, after the war. I can't remember what we ate. No.
Do you
Not
remember?
like my mother.
Do you remember celebrating Shabbat?
No.
Mm-hmm. Or any other Jewish holiday at all?
Not before the war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after the war, I do remember my mother lighting the candles on Friday. No, before the war. Because I would have been only 2 while it was still quiet, right? In 1939, and certainly not after that, I don't think there was much, celebrating of Shabbat.
Do you remember any celebrations of any other kind? Birthdays?
No. I do remember when I was in hiding celebrating Christmas Eve, but I don't know if that's the same kind of celebration. I happen to remember Christmas Eve at that time. Before, no. Actually, there was one food, now that you mention it, and again, when it would have been, maybe when my mother visited my grandfather, there was a dish that they made on Friday for Saturday, because Saturday you couldn't cook. It was called chulent. Did you ever hear anything
Yes.
like that? And I think either I liked it or I at least remember that that was a food that was eaten. That was sort of maybe a little ethnic.
Did there ever come a time when you sensed trouble or danger in your house before you went into hiding?
Well, like I mentioned, that train trip, right? That train trip. The back and forth to Dombrova, to Przemyśl, I don't think I actually remember feeling, stressed or tense, but I think that I knew that my father wasn't there, so I knew that something was wrong. How my mother explained it to me or what I actually felt before I went into hiding, I don't remember. I don't remember times of great joy or times of great sadness before the hiding. I think I was maybe just too young at age 2 or even 3 to really remember that.
Do you remember your parents ever instructing you in how to behave?
Yes.
Okay, what did they say?
But that was later.
Well,
Do you mean just in bringing me up or in telling me that we're in such a situation that there are certain...
that you're in a situation.
Yes. To obey, to be quiet, not to draw attention to myself, not to want to stand out or be seen or be heard. I tend to be a little shy. I don't know if that's a result or if, if I was taught that. So I don't think I ever found it all that difficult to, to obey these rules. And of course, there were a couple of incidents, one that I do remember when I was in hiding, where I knew that I had to be quiet. Do you want to hear about that?
Yes, tell me the story.
This was a time when I was visiting my mother in her hiding place, and my mother was hidden in I don't know if it was an attic or just a little addition to the apartment where she was hiding. It was a 2x4, a tiny room, and I think it had this kind of sloping wall, so that she did have to be bent most of the time. Now, I don't think she spent 24 hours a day in that place. I think she could be in the house if nobody was expected or if it wasn't an especially, dangerous time. There were no actions nearby. And I would sometimes come and visit her there. And there was one particular time when I was visiting, it had to be maybe a Saturday, and somebody knocked on the door, and they were visitors, unexpected visitors to the family that was hiding my mother. So my mother went into her hiding place, that was fine, and I was asked to go under a sofa in this living room where these guests had arrived. And I'm quite sure that I remember it, because I can't see, anybody telling this to me. There were either lice or ticks or some kind of insects in the upholstery of that sofa, which was quite an old sofa, and I was lying there, and something was definitely crawling on me. I was getting very, very itchy, but I knew that I could not come out from under, that I could not whimper or cry or scream, that I just had to put up with being itchy, and I remember thinking, hoping that this would soon be over, and I guess it was. But that was one time when I knew that I could not complain, that I could not, there was nothing that was going to save me from that. I had to take care of it myself and not make it worse.
Do you remember where this place was, where your mother was hiding?
My mother was hiding, it wasn't Krakow, the name of the street, I don't remember.
Do you remember the name of the family?
Yes, Kostuch was their name. Kostuch. And my mother was there the whole time that we were in hiding.
Do you remember ever having to wear a yellow star?
I don't remember ever having to wear that. And I think I remember more than just that picture where on the train, you know, I took out the picture of my mother wearing it. I could possibly remember my mother wearing that or seeing it on a coat of hers. Not my father's, but my mother. I believe that I saw it. I couldn't be 100% sure.
That incident on the train, do you recall what your mother said to you when you took out the photograph?
I think she was trying to act very normal, natural, and sort of easygoing, and she did, you know, again, she did not draw an over amount of attention to herself. She didn't yell at me. She didn't just kind of, it was done already. I think if she had made a fuss about it, it would have been worse. So she was just hoping that what I was doing or was going to do was not going to be worse than what had already happened. But the German definitely saw, because I remember showing it.
Did he ever say anything to you?
No, no, just kind of played along, and it happened to have been, I think, one of the nicer Germans, because already beforehand I felt a little, you know, friendship or something toward him. I didn't know if I knew to be terrified at that time of the uniform, of the, you know, of the boots, of the sticks, of the whatever. At that particular time on the train, I don't know.
Do you remember ever having a scary moment or a frightening experience?
This, again, I'm not certain if my mother told me about it. I must have been there, and I think my mother told me that I was frightened, but I don't remember having the fear myself. It was in Dombrova, and there was one of these actions, and several Germans came into where my mother was living. Maybe it was in my grandfather's house, and my mother had like a room there, and she was there with me. And I don't know exactly what they wanted, but they started going through. My mother had like a trunk of stuff, because I guess she took it maybe from, you know, from Bonarovska, and, you know, she brought it over there. And she said the German just started throwing things out of that trunk, and I think she said he found like a pair of leather gloves that he liked, so of course they appropriated whatever, you know, there was, and I don't think my mother made any fuss about that, but she must have said something or done something, or maybe, you know, you didn't even have to do much or say much to incur the anger of one of these Germans, and he slapped my mother. He just whacked her across the face, and I became frightened, and I, you know, cried. But I can't tell you that that's something, I mean, right now, I can't say I remember the moment, but it's vivid enough in my mind that I believe some of it I remembered, and some of it, you know, my mother maybe told later to my father, or, you know, to someone like that. But that was a scary moment. When Gabby came in '94 to my father and, you know, reminded me of the doll that we had and the hopscotch, she remembered other incidents when Germans would knock on the door. There was one of these actions. And one time she said her mother, they were also living on the ground floor. Her mother took me, opened the window, and just put me outside the window. It would have been maybe like a window like this, while the Germans came through. And at other times, she would take me and, you know, have me kind of just rock in her arms that I was sleeping, and, you know, they went through the house and did what they sort of had to. And I was there as a cousin of this Gabby, as the daughter of a sister of Mrs. Zayonchkovska, who was, you know, my rescuer. So if there were questions, who I was, but I was sleeping, so I didn't have to answer any questions.
Do you recall having to leave your home and your family? Do you remember that moment when you had to go into hiding?
I don't remember that moment, and I don't think it was from Ponerovska into hiding. It was these trips to Dombrova and to Przemysl and to, you know, other places. So it wasn't like actually losing my permanent residence and then being, you know, thrown into hiding.
You were already on the road.
I was on the road, right, right.
Well, tell me how you came to live with this Polish family, and what was the name again?
The Polish family that kept me were Mrs. Zayonchkovska, and she was living with her mother, her two sisters, and her daughter. So there were already 4 women living there, and she took me. My mother was taken in by Mrs. Kostu with her husband. She had a daughter and 2 sons, I believe, maybe 3 sons. I don't know if they were all living in the house. And my father was taken in by a family called Scotch, a couple, and they had a couple of daughters, but I think maybe the daughters were already out of the house, were married. How we got these families is quite interesting. I guess there was talk at that time of, you know, I think maybe most of the people in Krakow at that time knew that Jews were disappearing. All of a sudden they weren't there anymore. And, you know, the concentration camps and being sent off somewhere and never heard from again, I think, you know, a lot of people, the denial somehow maybe had stopped the first couple of years that, you know, they're somewhere, they've been sent here, they've been sent there, they'll come back, or they really are somewhere. So the reality of hiding became like a possibility. And these 3 families were gotten in this way. My grandfather employed Gentile workers in his factory. He had a good name and a good reputation. He was a generous boss. And my uncle, who now owned part of my grandfather's business, was friendly with a couple of these, and they offered to get together and find some people to take us in. The 3 families that took us kind of got together, and the couple that took my father said, the man said, well, I could have somebody in the house who was sort of my age, and I'll take the man. And Mrs. Zayonchkovska said, I have a little girl, I'll take the girl. And the other couple took my mother. A little aside here, that the same kind of situation was offered to this uncle of mine who owned half of my grandfather's business, but he felt he could not hide. He had a young wife and a baby, and they were killed in a concentration camp. So there were some people who felt they just could not hide. They could not lose that kind of freedom.
How did you know this uncle perished?
You know, as any of these things were discovered later on, somebody saw somebody. In fact, the way he perished, there was a story to it, and it's probably true because I think maybe somebody who knew him told my parents. He was very, very nearsighted, and he had heavy glasses, and he was being I don't know if it was in the concentration camp or in one of these labor camps or whatever, and he was told to move along. He dropped his glasses, and he needed to, go back to find his glasses, and they just shot him. And how the wife and child perished, I'm not certain. I think in a concentration camp. I don't know if they were together.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember seeing large groups of people being moved about or leaving from one place or going to another place?
I don't remember that, but I do remember it's like an underground shelter. I remember during my time in hiding that we did go somewhere, and I remember hearing some kind of siren. I don't know if it was a fear of planes throwing bombs on the city. So these air raid type sirens would sound, and I do remember being in one of those shelters and remember being frightened and remember being. I think that was while I was in hiding. I don't think it was before.
These shelters were located where?
I think in Krakow.
Okay, they were not part of the house.
I can't tell you what this was, but it had to have been then, and it had to have been there, because it wasn't, in France, and it wasn't.
You stayed with a family by the name of
Zayinshkovska, right.
Zayinshkovska.
Right.
You were telling me that Mrs. Zayinshkovska, excuse me, was living there with a group of women.
Yes.
Okay. Where were the men?
The two sisters were maiden aunts of this Gabby. The other woman was their mother. So there were 3 sisters and a mother. Mrs. Zayinshkovska was the only one who was married, and her husband was in the Polish army. And in fact, this is sort of interesting because he went into the army quite, at the very beginning when they were taking men into the Polish army. I don't know if he volunteered or whatever. And she always felt, this she told us later, or perhaps I found it out through Gabby, that if she did a good deed, if she saved someone, maybe someone would save her husband. And the sadness of what happened to her husband, which Gabby did not find out until the wall came down, was that what was thought to have been a German attack was really a Russian attack. And he perished in a place called Katyn, where, it was a Russian massacre of the Polish army.
Okay, Christine, we're going to stop here. Thank you.
Okay.
This is tape 3, and I'm interviewing Christine Month. Christine, you were telling us about how you went into hiding in Krakow, and this was in what year?
Either 1942 or 1943. I have a feeling that it was 1942, and I believe that Gabby thinks that was the date also, but recently I saw a document that I really have to check more into that my father had written, and he seems to have placed the time at March 1943. Not certain.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was a ghetto that had been established in Krakow. Before you went into hiding, were you with your parents ever a part of that ghetto?
I believe that we were in the ghetto, but probably not for a very long time. And I do remember the way the story was told later was that in the ghetto it became obvious what was happening to the Jews, the ones that were never seen again, the transports and so on. And I think really it was my mother's vision, resourcefulness to do something to get out of that ghetto, or one would not survive. And that's when the idea to go into hiding came. But there's one incident I think I remember, and again I was very, very small, but I do remember being sent on some kind of message, some kind of mission. I remember being just very small, very lost, very alone, with a little piece of paper in my hand that my mother had given me to bring this somewhere, to some address. Either she would meet me there, or I would wait for her there. I would spend the night. I do remember some, you know, it's like your bad dream, like just not knowing what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to go, what will await you on the other side. And I don't remember much more about it. I think my mother either did meet me or I was picked up by somebody else and brought to my mother, but this wasn't the ghetto.
Do you remember going into the ghetto?
No, the actual day of sort of liquidating the apartment, and no.
Do you recall any particular sights or sounds or smells of that time? While
Before the hiding, you mean?
Yes, while you were in the ghetto or on your way out of the ghetto?
No, no. And whether I saw any, you know, atrocity and was sheltered somehow from it by, you know, by my mother's lap or skirt or face, I can't tell you that I did. If I did, then I certainly don't remember it. So if I did and I blanked it out, that's a possibility, or maybe I just did not.
Do you remember meeting anyone and then discovering that that person had disappeared?
No. You know, my grandfather was killed in one of those actions in Dombrova, and we were there, but we found some hiding place not far from where my grandfather was taken out and shot. And I'm quite sure that one of his daughters, who was married and had 3 children, was living with him at that time. And that's how she and her children and husband were killed also. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm quite sure. And these were cousins of mine whom I did know. I can't say that I remember being told they're no longer here and missing them, because I don't. And besides which, that time was such, you know, the uncertainties and the confusions, you didn't have time to mourn. So if somebody did die and I was not going to see them again, that was not my worst concern at the time. My concern and that of my parents was, am I going to be around the next day? So I can't say that I remember, you know, knowing someone and then not having them.
Do you remember being told what these actions were?
Not at the time, but I do remember when I was in hiding that I was told how to behave and how not to behave when they occurred. Nobody explained to me, you know, why they were taking place, just that I shouldn't be seen somewhere and found and taken out. So whatever I could do to prevent that by not talking, not drawing attention to myself, not crying, screaming, complaining, that would serve me best.
Did anyone ever describe to you what happened to your grandfather in Dombrova?
No. But my mother later, this is, at some point, maybe 15 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, my mother was still well. We became a little interested in knowing, and my mother used to come visit here quite often, and especially Mal, my husband, wanted her to write something about that time. And she started. She obviously either could not or maybe it was too hard. But she did write a page or two that I still sort of have, and that this was something she never told me and I did not know, that the way the Germans, or maybe even some of the Polish anti-Semitic people, would taunt certainly the Orthodox Jews. My mother said when my grandfather walked the streets, they would go like this and smile as though they're going to cut off the payas, which was, of course, sort of a sacrilege. So she did write that as a beginning about her father. What was the question you asked me that I answered that to? Forgot.
Well, I'm going to ask you another one. Is there anything else about that time in the ghetto that you remember, that you can tell us anything about? How you got in and out, how your parents got in and out, what they did, what you did while you were there?
You mean this is before the hiding?
Yes.
About myself, I really can't remember, and about my parents, maybe I was told this after, but I think my mother did manage to go in and out of the ghetto. I think she just took off the armband and she tried to pass, as not Jewish. Because I have a feeling that in order to arrange this hiding, I don't think these Gentile people came into the ghetto. I think my mother had to go and meet them on their sort of turf. So there was taking a bit of a risk and going in and out. I don't know how often. I don't know what the risk actually was to them when they felt it was, a little quieter and maybe they could.
So you're saying that you're assuming that there must have been some sort of communication between your mother and the Gentile families on the outside of the ghetto.
So, yes.
Right, and that's how you came to be with these people? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. And there was something else, but I think this probably already was after the hiding. My grandfather had buried those African coins, Krugerrands, on the outskirts of Krakow. He had buried these coins, and he told my mother where these were. And the people who took us in were, we gave them what we sort of had. The money ran out before the end of the war, and they kept us. They certainly did not betray us. But at first there was a little bit of money. And my mother took one of the workers from that factory and showed him where this was. And after that, during the war, I guess, when we were in hiding, he would go there, unearth these Krugerrands, and actually hand them to my mother, and that's how my mother, paid the families. So there was this sort of contact between inside and outside, but this had to have been after they left the ghetto, because this was when we were in hiding.
Do you remember how old you were when you went into hiding?
If it was 43, then I was 6 to 8, but I have a feeling it was 5 to 8, but it was 42. Somehow it was 42.
And
because wasn't the ghetto liquidated in 42? I couldn't have gone into hiding in 43. I don't have the...
did you have to change your name when you went into hiding?
I remained Krisha. As far as my last name, my parents did get these Aryan papers. I don't know if they ever used them because they were basically in hiding, and I don't really see the purpose. I mean, if my father was found behind the credenza during an action by a German to pull out a paper that says his name is Mr. Sendwak, which, it would have been totally ridiculous. So I think maybe these papers were obtained before the hiding. Maybe the idea was, well, we can pass for Gentile and nobody will bother us. Mm-hmm. But then it became quite evident that that would not do, that was not enough.
So your last name was what?
Sendwak.
Can you spell it?
S-E-N-D-W-A-K. W, which is a Polish letter, AK, but my first name remained. And my mother and father had the same last name, and I believe their first name was also changed, and they had papers to that effect, but I can't quite remember their first name. Just that Leon and Erna sounded a little ethnic, so they received more Polish-sounding names.
Mm-hmm. So then the last name that they were using was not the same as the last name you were using.
Why?
I don't know. You said that they used different names. I'm asking you.
No, they used Sendwak, were these papers that we had.
So you all
were,
had that name.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
That's
okay,
right.
Yes.
And possibly, see, I can't remember ever being asked my name.
Mm-hmm.
If I was, I would give that as a name because I
Mm-hmm.
was the niece of Mrs. Zajączkowska, and perhaps my mother's name was Sendwak.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which sounded more Polish than,
Mm-hmm.
than our name.
What do you remember about your very first day at the house of Zajączkowska?
I can't remember the first day.
No.
I remember some moments during the hiding, but again for 2 or 3 years, maybe a handful of moments. Do you want to hear about some of the things I do remember?
Oh, sure, yes.
I do remember Christmas and Christmas Eve, not, the gifts and the tree and that festivity, but I remember the table being set for a meal. Christmas Eve, they were Catholic, and, that, I guess, is a late church evening. And there was the most delicious fried white fish, which I had never, I guess, tasted in my house, and I really, really liked that. I remember that. I remember being taken to church. I remember praying on my knees, crossing myself. I don't know who taught me this prayer, but it was something that I did, and it wasn't it wasn't anything from the Bible or anything where I had to say Jesus or Christ, but it was something to the effect, please God, and I beg you, and help. And, maybe Mrs. Zajączkowska taught me to, to sort of say something like that. But I do remember, crossing myself, and must have been taught that there. Gabby had some cousins who used to come and play, and I remember one little boy who was her cousin, and we were sort of, friendly and played together. A very important thing that happened to me there was I didn't go to school. I could not go to school, and I was of school age. But I was taught to read and write by Mrs. Zajączkowska and her sisters, and I remember having notebooks of handwriting. I remember the way they taught me how to write. You make circles, rows and rows and lines of circles for the A's and the O's and lines, And I do remember having been taught to write that way. And I'm sure I was taught to read because after the war ended in 1945, I remember in 1946 reading quite a thick Polish book, when I was out of hiding already before we went to France. So I was taught to read there. I don't remember reading any specific thing, but I do remember being taught how to read and write. I can't remember her aunts. I do remember her mother a little, but again, maybe from seeing the pictures, I seem to have her face. She told me when she came in '94 that I was very attached to her mother, and I clung to her. I imagine having lost one mother, maybe I wanted to make sure I held on to this one. And I think she told me that I was in some kind of bed where maybe there was like a screen or something like that, and it was close to Mrs. Zajączkowska's bed, and that I dug a hole in that screening and tried to hold on to her mother. So possibly that I was more interested in being with her mother maybe sometimes than, being outside or playing or I imagine I was a little depressed, although I don't remember the feeling.
Do you remember being separated from your mother?
I remember missing my mother. I remember missing my parents. But I can't say that there were any scenes if we had to leave each other, because I did see my mother, and apparently, according to Gabby, she would come on the weekends on a Saturday or a Sunday and take us to, to our old house.
Did you enjoy that? Enjoy seeing your mother?
Again, I'm sure I did, but it's not, I can't remember that feeling. I can't remember the actual. That I did not even remember, and that was not something my mother really talked to me about and told me. That I only heard from Gabby, that she would come and, and take us. And she was really taking a chance, because she was not supposed to be outside. She would take us to this house and then bring us back and then go back to her own place of hiding. But she somehow wanted to do that to, I'm sure, maintain the contact with me, as well as to do something for this family that she felt so grateful to.
Do you recall your mother saying anything to you about how often you would see her, or how you should act while you're with the
I think I remember my mother saying, "Do you have enough to eat?" That's something I'm quite sure I remember, because that's not something that I would have been told after. Worrying if I had enough to eat, if I ate enough. Not that she thought I wasn't being fed, but did I eat?
She was not concerned about how the Zajanczkowska family was treating you?
Oh, she was, of course, concerned, but I think she trusted them, and there was enough evidence. She saw me often enough to see that I was as well taken care of as possible. And, whatever unhappiness there was in me, and I don't really remember relating to my mother and crying or complaining, I don't remember that. But if that was there, that was not something that happened because they were not nice to me, or, just was.
Who initially took you to the Zajanczkowska household?
Who took me? You mean who actually dropped me off there? Who?
Well, were you escorted there? How did you get there?
That I don't remember, but perhaps at one of those meetings where somebody said, "I'll take the man and I'll take the child," because maybe the three families were there and my parents were there and maybe then we just went off with each one with our. That could have been. I don't remember it, and I don't remember talking about it.
Do you remember bringing anything with you?
No. You mean like toys or like clothing? No. I know that during the the time that I was in hiding and my mother would come and pick us up and take us, she would sew these magnificent little outfits for us. Sometimes she would just, see like a curtain in the house, which was her house in Bonarovska, and take it down, and out of that the next week or in 2 weeks we would have aprons and dresses, and identical always for Gabby and for me. But I don't really remember having anything that, like toy or that I was attached to.
You said that your mother had this arrangement with a German
postal inspector.
Postal inspector,
yes.
And that's how she managed to essentially hold on to her apartment.
Yes.
Do you remember the name of this man?
No, but he certainly was, as you know, there were some decent Nazis and some not, and he just was one of the decent ones. Mm-hmm. He, as I said, offered my mother a job to be his cleaning lady, which she declined. He didn't do anything about that. He could have. What he knew of my mother's, he knew she was Jewish. He may have known we were in hiding. He offered her, I don't know where the keys were kept, if my mother had a set of keys or if they were left somewhere. But we did have access to that apartment, my mother did, because of his, he just looked the other way. He wasn't there on the weekends, he didn't use it. And after the war, he left that apartment intact the way it had been before. I don't know what happened to him.
Mm-hmm. And never divulged who
No.
you were or who your mother was?
No.
Did you understand initially why you were going into hiding when you arrived at the Zajanczkowska household?
I don't know. I'm sure I was told something. I'm sure I wasn't, kept in the dark.
Can you remember anyone trying to explain it to you?
No. No.
Did you know that you were Jewish?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I must have been told that if I'm asked, I have to say I'm Catholic. And I was taken to church and I, used to pray. But that was, I guess, just the custom in the house. I don't think, I was 2 before the war. I don't know what kind of indoctrination into Judaism my parents gave me. I don't think they sort of did. It wasn't, that before the war, even though my grandfather was Orthodox, I think maybe my parents were sort of more liberal. Maybe my mother, even without, the Holocaust, which sort of ended all that religious way of life. I don't know how very observant I would have become.
Do you remember ever visiting a synagogue?
No, but I do remember visiting a church, but not a synagogue, because,
Before you went into hiding?
No. I don't think I would have visited a synagogue during, after 39. I don't think so. If I did, it would have been in Dombrova where my grandfather was, but I don't remember.
Can you recall any other special kindnesses from the Zajanczkowska family or from any of the other people who were hiding you at that time?
I don't remember any unkindnesses. I don't think I was ever elated or happy. I knew that I was somehow different, that my situation was different. I didn't go to school. I wasn't living with my parents. But as far as certainly everybody was nice to me and liked me as far as, I can, and the kindnesses, those, the Gentile workers in my grandfather's factory, certainly the ones who suggested these people that hit us and the ones who, or at least the one who unearthed, the Krugerrands and did not run off with them and gave them to my mother. Certainly the people who lived in the building where I was hiding, who probably suspected that I was not maybe just a niece. I was there an awfully long time, 2-3 years, to be, just the daughter of some woman that sort of got sick. And it wasn't, there were at least 6-8 families living there. And, concierge, who knew the comings and goings.
Mm-hmm.
So these could be considered kindnesses. Nobody, betrayed me or...
You said you knew you were different, but what did that mean to you? How were you different?
That's... Do I remember it then, or do I recreate the picture now that I was a little bit on the outside looking in? Gabby had a mother, Gabby had her aunts, Gabby had a grandmother, Gabby had cousins. I didn't. Gabby went to school. I had to be different. I don't think I had less to eat. I don't think they gave her more. I was, I think, dressed very well. My mother made certain that I had, good shoes, that all these things that she could still provide for me. And, with the money that was there, she probably gave Mrs. Ionchkovska for her and maybe something for me also. So I didn't feel that. But I think I did. I felt different. I couldn't speak out. I had to watch what I said. I couldn't be spontaneous. I think I felt that. That's not just something that I'm thinking now had to have been.
Was that okay with you, or was that something that you found disturbing?
I wasn't happy, that I know. Disturbing to the point, who is there to complain to? There's no God of the Holocaust. You don't say why is, it just maybe you took everything, you accepted everything, but within it, perhaps when I think of my mother who, was sitting in an attic, stooped over, and yet maybe looked forward to a weekend where she could see me, and she was sewing. Maybe there was still some life, So, was it all right with me? It was, and I don't know how pressure or sadness or depression, manifests itself in a small child. I wasn't sick. I didn't need, doctors. I was all right.
You said you had gone to church. Yeah. Did you ever go anywhere else?
You see, I didn't remember some of that until Gabby came and brought these pictures from the country. Apparently her uncle had a farm, and we would be taken there. So, I'm there sitting in some meadow with Gabby and her cousins and Gabby's mother. And in another photo, we're feeding the chickens. I look more like I'm afraid of them than, anything else. But I guess, I did. I don't think I was taking to any sort of public places, but this was family.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the idea of, fresh air and maybe good for one's health also. Maybe that's...
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to stop, Christine.
Okay.
Thank you. Number 4, and I'm interviewing Christine Month. Christine, you were telling us about some of your experiences while you were hiding with the Zayinchkovska family. And I think we left off by talking about some of the places that you went to outside. So therefore you weren't confined to any particular place. You were free.
Right. That's right. That's right.
To
I
move
was
about.
not, yes. I was not, quote, hidden. And I think that had something to do perhaps with my look, that I did not look all that Jewish. So if I was with Gabby and her mother and her aunts, I did not stick out as there's a Jewish girl. And so they felt they could take me. Because had I looked that way, I think there would be too many questions. And of course, you know that if they were discovered hiding me, their life was lost as well as mine. So
The young girl that you became very close to, her name was Gabby, you said? Gabby Zayinchkovska?
Zayinchkovska.
Right. What kinds of things did you do together? Did you play games?
We played games. Again, this is not something that I actually remember. but she filled me in on some of that. The hopscotch, the doll with without the leg, or we had given it a name. I think Andrew, Anji, something like that in Polish. Just I actually remember this with a stick after it had rained. Not everything was paved, and we would draw in it wasn't actually mud, but it was sort of settled. Things like that. She told me that I liked, in fact she quoted, and I wish I had it. I correspond with her, so I'm going to ask her to write me this in the next letter. A 4-line little poem that I apparently recited over and over with maybe some dramatic, elan, I don't know. And well, she was going to school, so, she had, I guess, maybe homework and sort of things like that. I don't know if, I did also write and read and so on, but maybe when she came back from school, she had to do her homework, and I didn't have to do it then because I had sort of all day since I was not in school. But I think we got along. There was no... no problem between us. She told a funny story, actually, that when she started school, she must have started school during the time that I was there. I don't think there's kindergarten in Poland, but first grade would have been, right, maybe 6. And of course, nobody in school was supposed to know that there was anybody living in her house. But when the teacher went around and asked, "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" she decided to show off that she has a little sister at home. Now, everybody knew that her father was gone since 1939 in the army. So I think the teacher got a little bit, she questioned whatever, and maybe Mrs. Janczkowska told Gabby after that not to divulge what was in the house.
Gabby was going to school, and you were being schooled at home.
Right.
Right. Did you feel badly that you weren't going to school? Did you feel like you were missing something?
Not that I remember.
No.
No, I don't remember that.
Did you ever wonder why you were separated from your parents, why you had to live separately? Did that ever cross your mind?
I think I knew at the time. I think I knew. I don't know if I was told that it was because of my religion. I was probably, if I know the way my mother would have handled something like that, was told that it was going to be over, and that it was going to be over soon, and we would be together, and it was just something I had to put up with, and that there was nothing anybody could do about it. I don't know if she told me it was anybody's fault or whatever, but I think the idea was not to have me lose control, because that was not going to serve anybody anything. I had to obey.
You said you saw your mother. Did you ever see your father while you were in hiding?
I saw my father occasionally, and I would be brought to where he was hiding. And he always had a cream puff for me. He was able to, I guess, the people who hid him, maybe when they knew that I was coming, got these sort of special pastries. But the Polish cream puffs are extremely, they're a little bit like the French pastries. I still remember what they looked like. They were like little squares with, they were actually not cream puffs, they were milfeys. And it was like a very sort of flaky dough with a custard. My father liked those, and he liked to have me have them.
Your father was the one with the sweet tooth.
Yeah,
huh?
my father. The Margali sweet tooth.
Yeah.
It's gone down.
What else did you do when you were with your father?
With my father?
Yes.
I can't. But I do know a couple of incidents that happened to my father. Now, I don't think they happened while I was there, and they must have been things that I was told about later. there were a couple of these actions. One was an extremely close call that my father talked about for a long time after. My father was hidden behind a sort of like a credenza, which was a tall piece of furniture with maybe like dishes and cups, you know, in the front. And he was quite a tall person, but this thing was taller. And if anybody, you know, knocked on the door, if anybody would come into the house, he would hide there. And one time, I think they had left the curtains opened, and the light. And you were not allowed because, you know, the planes could sort of see, so the curtains were not allowed to be opened when the lights were on, and there was a big to-do. Knocking on, you know, the doors, and it sounded like a bad action, like a lot of Germans. So my father, I think that was part of the arrangement, that if it became very, you know, scary, that he couldn't just hide behind that credenza, but on every floor in that apartment building there was a bathroom on the floor where the families use the you know, like the toilet outside. And that's where my father would have to hide so that it wouldn't be known which family had, you know, kept it. And my father went into that toilet, and he actually had a cyanide pill. I think maybe a lot of people did at that time who knew what it meant to be tortured. And he went to hide there, and there was knocking. The Germans, you know, one of the Germans knocked on that door, and my father told the story that he was ready to take the cyanide when the German his attention was diverted by another one who called to him, and he just left. So that was...
Do you recall if anyone ever
Close
came
call.
to visit you when you were at the Zayinshkovska household?
Visit as far as...
Were there any Germans that came to the house?
Well, the one story that I heard from Gabby after, when her mother like put me out, you know, out the window, there was sort of no time to hide me, and that was maybe a more worrisome action. So I was just left outside, you know, on the sort of, it was maybe a window, like here.
But do you remember actually seeing any German soldiers in the house?
No, I can't remember that.
Do you recall ever being punished by the family for anything?
No. Do you recall eating anything special while you were at the Zayinshkovska household? I know you described... that fried fish on Christmas
yes.
Eve. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't remember any special treats or any... I think perhaps, you know, when you're a little depressed or when you're not... I mean, I tend to be that way even to now. Some people, when they're depressed, they gain weight there, you know. I tend to eat less. So I was, I think, thin. When you see some of those pictures of me, there's one taken maybe in 43, 44. My legs look, you know, very, very thin. I don't think I enjoyed my food at that time.
But you ate with the family?
I ate with the family, yes. Yes.
And you used the facilities, the
Yes,
bathroom, as much as you
as
wished?
far as I remember, and I can't remember details, I was treated really like another daughter of Mrs. Zayinshkovska, like Gabby's sister.
And you were being schooled at home?
Yes.
So they were giving you lessons?
Yes.
Were there any lessons that you disliked?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. Did you acquire any particular possessions while you were in hiding? Did they give you gifts or?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
And maybe I would, as I remember that doll after the Holocaust. I still remember what that doll looked like and how she looked dressed. So I did have something, but I can't remember having had anything.
Any special
before.
clothes, maybe?
No, just what my mother sewed, and I didn't, know about that until I saw those pictures that Gabby brought in '94.
Did you ever celebrate a birthday while you were in hiding?
I don't remember that. I don't.
Now, you said that you went to church. Did you receive any formal religious training at all?
I don't think so. But you know, the schools in Krakow were, like where Gabby went was a religious school. So if I had gone to school, it would have had to have been, you know, that kind of school.
You said that Mrs. Zajanczkowska had taught you a prayer, but you weren't sure if that was something that was part of the liturgy or something that she made up?
No,
Is that
it
right?
had to have been what she made up.
She made up
Yeah,
for you?
because it went something like, my dearest, most wonderful God, I beg you, please. And then maybe I, you know, put in a request or something, you know, maybe she said at this point you can ask for, you know. So that's the prayer that I said. Now, you know, whether she taught it to me or whether I heard Gabby say prayers and maybe I improvised something, I can't be certain. I don't remember Mrs. Zajanczkowska sitting down with me and saying, now we pray and say this. Maybe since she, I think, was a religious woman, maybe she felt that would help me and maybe that would, you know, good things would come from it. So maybe I should know such a thing. I can't remember how I came to know that prayer, but, you know, I'm 60 years old and shades of that prayer are still there.
Do you remember praying for anything else?
It was one of these, that everything should be good, and then maybe that I should see my mother, and that I should see my father, and that, you know, we should be together, or that I don't think I knew that people were dying, that I had already lost aunts and uncles and cousins. I wasn't that specific.
Were there crucifixes in the house?
I don't remember them, but I think there were. I think it was just that kind of, you know, house. And Gabby showed me pictures in '94 of, you know, what the house looked like. She's still in the same house. And I think by the, over the bed.
What did you think of these symbols when you went to church, or the symbols that you saw in the house?
I don't think I questioned it too much, or was curious, or maybe I don't even remember being told by my own parents that, you know, survival was the thing uppermost in our mind. So I don't think my parents ever told me, this is really not your religion. When we get out of this, you'll be Jewish, and, you know, and it was just kind of try and get by with this, but this is not really, that was not. They were interested if I was eating, if I was going to, you know, make it, if this thing should ever be over.
Did you ever worry about being thrown out or turned over to the Germans at all?
I don't remember thinking about that, but I think that you know, that I must have been worried about something. Now, you know, I have even now and over the years, I guess what you call a fear of abandonment. You know, if my husband calls me from work and tells me he'll be here in 30 minutes, and it's 40 minutes, I begin to worry. If it's 50 minutes, I'll get into my car and start driving along the route. I don't know if that would have been the case if I had not gone through what I went through. But, so there was that kind of, I think there must have been a fear that even though I already was abandoned because I wasn't with my parents, but would it be worse? Would there be one day when my mother would not come and take me? Or, you know, I think that was there, that it could still be worse, that even though I was in a way abandoned, I still had some chance or some hope of you know, getting out of it. I don't think I worried as much about my own well-being or pain done to me as about my parents.
Did anyone ever threaten you to throw you out or to turn you over to the Germans ever?
Not that I remember that at all, no.
Altogether, how long were you in hiding?
If it was 42, it would have been 3 years.
Mm.
If it was 43, it would have been 2, but I think it was 3.
Who liberated you?
The Russians.
Exactly where were you when that happened?
We were in hiding. Now, the day that it happened, I don't remember. But I was told by Gabby when she came in '94 that what happened was Krakow was liberated, and I think it was on January 17th, which happens to be my birthday. My parents told me that after. Gabby said that one day my parents just arrived at the door and asked for me. And of course, that was the deal and that was going to be. But she told me that her mother cried for days after that at having lost me. Do I remember a feeling of elation at going off with my parents and finding that this is finally over? I don't remember that. Did I feel sad that I was leaving Mrs. Zayonchkovska? I don't remember that. Eventually, probably very soon after, I was just glad to be free and to be with my parents.
So how old were you then when you were liberated?
In 1945, on January 17th, I had just turned 8.
Did the word liberation mean anything to you?
No, I don't even know if that word was used. It would have been a Polish word, which was probably very similar. No, but I think the way it was explained to me was that I could be with my parents. That was the liberation.
And that you could leave?
And that I could leave, of course, but that I could be with my parents, because I don't think there was anything so terrible there other than, the threat of whatever these actions were, of whatever, who wanted to do me harm, that wasn't there anymore. But I think not only for children, but even for adults, that didn't quite sink in. You still kind of, we very quickly realized that we wanted out of Poland. This is good now, but how long is this going to last?
Were you upset when you left the Zayonchkovska family?
See, I don't remember that. And Gabby just told me that her mother cried for a few days. Did I? I'm sure I grew attached to that woman. I can't.
If someone had asked at the end of your period of hiding who you were, what would you have answered them?
You mean if they asked me my name or my religion or something like that?
Who are you?
At this moment?
When you were, right, at the period, when your hiding came to an end, yes.
Who am I when my hiding came to an end? I hope I was Krisha Margolius. I think I felt myself being the child of my parents and whatever that life was, and not, Gabby's sister, Mrs. Zayonchkovska's daughter, a Gentile little girl having gone to church. I don't. Certainly, very soon after, I knew I was, the other. I didn't immediately have, any kind of religious support. My grandparents were all gone, all my aunts, all my uncles, all my cousins. So I didn't have that to, to bring me back to whatever I had been before. And it was a different kind of life after that. But I'm quite sure I never said to my parents, I miss this other life, I would like that again. I doubt.
What do you think that you've learned about people and about life, or even about yourself, while you were in hiding?
You mean at that time, or
Well,
the way I see it later?
Can you think back?
My my view of that time, well, first the losses, you know. There was that sister. I would have had a sister 2 years younger than me. I lost all my aunts and uncles and cousins, except for, you know, the couple that left for Palestine. But I survived, and I survived with my parents, and it was through the kindness or goodness of those Gentile people who saw me through. And finally, as I look back on it now and even over the years, it was only a part of my life. My life after the Holocaust, sure, I'm left probably with some phobias and some fears, which maybe I wouldn't have had, although, you know, I don't know. But all along, from the time I was quite small, I wanted to be married and have children, and I had that. And I had a rewarding long career to boot, and more, much, much more. So, of course, it was a horrible event, but maybe I escaped not seeing the real horrors in the concentration camps and the, you know, but you know, what I learned other than that, you know, as I look back over it and as I think about it in my, you know, later years now, it was an event that I believe people should know about. People should know that it happened and what happened and how it happened. Because, not that I knew it then, but, you know, what starts with a curtailing of a freedom ends in the gas chambers, and that's, I think, what happened there. I don't think anybody will ever understand the full impact of why and what kind of people there were. There were not only monsters at that time in that place. And, you know, some of the goodness maybe would not have come out if not for the other. Not that, God forbid, I think, you know, we needed that to show that some people can be good. I think I'm rambling.
What was the very first thing that you did after you were liberated? Do you remember?
That would be a good thing to remember, but I don't. But we did go back to Bonarovska. I mean, just the idea, I imagine, of freedom, of, you know, being able to go out, being able to maybe get whatever one wanted to eat, being able to take a bath, being able to get to know my parents again.
Was there a celebration?
You know, when the Russians liberated the Krakow, there were the Russians are very friendly, very, you know, at least certainly they were then for us. Lots of drinking, we were invited to a lot of these parties, and
What was that like?
that, you see, when I say to you that I remember not being happy during the Holocaust, I remember this as being somehow great, great joy, this celebration of, you know, for the Russians it was something also, you know, it wasn't just liberating us, but, you know, they had won something too. So lots of young people and just joy.
What were those parties like?
There.
Do you remember?
Singing, you know, singing. The Russians sang and danced and drank and partied into the night. And, you know, they were held in some, like, huge halls. I don't know where they weren't quite, you know, on the street, but, it felt good.
Did your parents start looking for anybody? Did you start looking for other Jews?
I'm sure that happened. I think that was probably the very first thing, and, you know, I don't quite remember how that was done. But I remember, besides, the first parties with the Russians that I'm talking about, our house was open to a lot of people and a lot of relatives, not, aunts and uncles and cousins. They had perished, but like second, third cousins, that kind of relatives, that were still like in Krakow, would come to our house, and my parents were sort of hospitable, and there was a lot of that going on. What the talk was, and I remember talking and so on, but I can't tell you, what was being said. But it was more, everybody had lost somebody, but yet the feeling of elation of being freed and still being alive, at least at first, before it hit what one, had lost, that overtook everything else.
When did you first, or when did your parents first learn about the fate of your relatives, or how did they learn about it?
I don't know that. It's too bad that I don't know that. That's something I wish I had asked. It might have, well, I think, like with my mother's brother, the one who dropped the glasses, I think that was already maybe known even before the war ended. Mm-hmm. How they found these things out, I never really thought about that. I don't know.
Do you remember reacting to that news? Do you remember hearing it?
No. And my grandfather and that aunt that I told you about earlier with the son and the two daughters, that happened during the war, so I think that was already. I think there may have been some contact. I think that a lot of these relatives of my mother's, at least, somebody knew that they had been taken somewhere and therefore were most likely not alive after. So I think that was known to my parents before.
We're going to stop, Christine.
Okay.
Thank you. This is tape number 5, and I'm interviewing Christine Month. Christine, we were last discussing your liberation and the fact that your parents came to the house of the Zajanskowska family to redeem you, and there was great celebration afterwards. Where did you go next? Where did your family go to next after this time?
This was 1945. We actually left Poland in 1946. I think maybe we would have even left sooner, but I believe I got the measles. I remember myself being sick and it lasting a little while. So perhaps we delayed our trip. Now, we next went to France, to Paris, where we stayed until 1949. Why Paris? I'm not certain. It seemed that a lot of, I have at least 3 distant cousins. They were second cousins of my father. All 3 of them were on Schindler's List, and they ended up in Paris. I don't know if that was the place to go for any specific reason, or if we sort of just ended up there. But the thought all along, and maybe it was right after the liberation, was to go to Palestine, where there were some relatives. And I believe that what happened was that my father was supposed to be sent, whatever it was that you were sent, I don't know, visas, passports, papers. I guess you needed someone to sponsor you into Palestine, by a cousin of his. But that somehow fell through. And so the next plan was to go to South America. I think maybe Bolivia. I don't know why. A lot of Jews were going there. But then this cousin of my mother's, Rabbi Hirschsprung, who was the chief rabbi of Montreal, sent us papers, and that's how we, in 1949, ended up in Montreal. How maybe they found out, maybe this Rabbi Hirschsprung found out that my mother was his first cousin, and the only Hirschsprung that, had survived the war, other than the three that had gone to Palestine before. Whether he found out that she was alive, or she maybe found out where he was. But when the Palestine thing fell through, the Canada, Montreal.
Your mother met her cousin, this Hirschsprung,
Right.
in Paris?
No, he wasn't in Paris. He was already in Canada.
Oh, I see.
He had left, I think he was one of the ones that went via Japan, Pearl Harbor somehow, the States, and Montreal. And he was sort of already established in Montreal, a little younger than my mother.
And he was corresponding with your mother, or how did your mother
find
him?
I don't know if she found him, or if he, having already been in Canada, tried to find out who, if there were some Jewish organizations to which he certainly would have had some access. But it wasn't long before people knew who was alive, who had survived, and I don't know if he came, if we got to Canada after the Palestine thing fell through, whether he had not been notified before, or whether my parents preferred Palestine to Canada, and then when that, didn't work out, they chose Montreal. I'm not sure.
When you arrived in Paris, where did you live?
In Paris itself.
Where in Paris?
At first, I think my parents had nothing. I mean, those Crew grants had run out. I don't know what kind of savings. My mother knew how to sew a little bit, but there was no really profession. She had never done that professionally. My father had owned a business. He was not, trained to do anything. We had maybe a couple of names of some people we knew in Paris, but the first place we lived in was a hotel. I remember living in that hotel, having like a little stove to cook on, right, there. My parents almost immediately sent me to a kind of boarding school. Now, they wanted to do good by me because they were struggling in a hotel, and what kind of a life was that? But I think I was devastated and sad. I had to leave again, I remember a friend from there, and I remember that, other parents did this, and it was a place called Valmondois, and it was, a lovely place. I was educated in French, but I wanted to be with my parents. This was very problematic. Then my father started to learn how to sew. He was going to become like what was called an operator, like a machinist. My father was totally unsuited to that. He was always more of an intellectual man, this sort of, but I think he did work at that a little bit, and so did my mother. And after the hotel, they managed to save up enough money to have to rent an apartment in Paris, a rather lovely little apartment, right, sort of in the center. Palais Royal is the area. And I was brought back from this boarding school and sent to school in Paris. And so I was able to be with my parents finally, which was... I did see my parents when I was in the other place. I remember my parents coming to get me and taking me for a weekend to Paris and taking me to movies. I remember a Charlie Chaplin movie. I think it was Monsieur Verdoux was playing then. But I remember while sitting in that theater knowing that when this is over, I have to go back, because it was Sunday evening. And it was definitely, a bit of a sad time for me again.
How long did you stay at the boarding school?
From 46, it was 3 years, right? That boarding school, perhaps 1 year or so, and then there was another one, like a little closer to Paris. And that, I think I was even unhappier in that one. I remember those Sunday evenings, my parents trying to tell me I had to, go back there, and really being quite miserable. Maybe another half a year, and then finally back with my parents and the school in Paris.
What was that name of the school again? In Paris that you went to?
The school in Paris, I don't remember, but the boarding school was Valmondois. That was the name of the place. And then there was another one sort of a little closer than this Valmondois, so I could see my parents maybe more often, but it was still, a sleepaway place. I was there like for the week. I think they would take me for the weekend, whereas from that Valmondois place, I think I was there the whole time. Maybe they came to visit me, but I don't think it was one of these where, I visited them. But from the second place, I did visit them, but I know I was very, very unhappy at that time. And then when they, saved up a little money and were able to rent a place, I lived at home and I went to school.
So while you were in boarding school, you must have complained a lot?
I'm sure I complained.
Mm-hmm. And they finally decided to do something about it?
I guess. And, I can understand it, it's, I'm sure they wanted to be with me as much as I wanted to be with them, but I think they were right in not leaving me in a hotel room. What do I do? Go to school, they go to work a whole day, I walk the streets of Paris, and I end up in a hotel room. Like this, I was under someone's care. Of course, I wanted to be with them, so that had to, it had to be a terrible conflict. But they wanted best for me, and I think they realized that I would agree. I would not become crazed. I would not become hysterical. And, that's a little my personality. I take what I'm handed out.
How did you adjust to the language?
I learned the language. I have a bit of an ease. My father spoke many languages. He spoke German and Hebrew and Jewish and Polish and French and English. So that was not a big problem. At home we always spoke Polish. I learned fluent French. I think I even learned to enjoy the schooling. At first the schooling was a little difficult in that in Paris at the time, I remember, it wasn't like you're 9 years old, so you're in 3rd grade. You're 9 years old, so we'll try you in this grade, but if you find this grade easy, we'll put you up. And they couldn't quite find the grade for me, because I was either too good, and they put me in something that was really too difficult, and I preferred to be in something a little easier so that I can shine. I was not happy in that sort of higher level, but that's, I think, where I stayed. And I remember I ended up getting some kind of prize in that school. And that's the principal of that school, actually, that looked at my birth certificate where it said, Christina, Krystyna. And she said, oh, that's Christine. And so I was given this name with the Christ in it, which is really a rather Gentile name. And, I carried that name. People always say, where did that name come from? It's an interesting... but that was Paris.
Do you remember any friends in Paris? Did you make any friends there?
Yes. I do remember going to somebody's house and walking. This was when I was already living with my parents. Mm-hmm. I do remember. I think one's little girl name was Danielle that I was friends with. Mm-hmm. I haven't thought about that at all.
Mm-hmm. And what were you most interested in while you were in school, overall?
Yeah, I like to read and I like to write, and I always had a little bit of, I'm not going to say it's a poetic flair, but I do write a little, and I like to rhyme and I like to read rhymes, and I think I like that right away.
Did you experience any anti-Semitism in school?
I didn't, because, you know, I'm wondering how many people knew I was Jewish. I didn't look it. My name was Christine, and I had it all sewn up. I, you know, went through a lot of my later days that way, not intentionally, I don't think, but I didn't. If people didn't know, I wasn't in a big hurry to tell them. So.
Do you remember any of your teachers in particular? Anyone stand out?
I remember I had a kind teacher in that place, Valmondois. I think I remember her name even, and somewhere in my things I must have like a little report card from 1947, which would have been 50 years ago. She was young and sort of kind, and it was just like a little piece of paper, and it would say, you know, handwriting, and we'd get marked out of 10, like 9 out of 10 math, and it was just this little piece of paper. I think I liked her.
What was her name?
I think it was Mademoiselle Repeti, something like that. That was in that first boarding school. In the second place that I so despised, I don't remember anybody. And I don't think anybody was not nice to me, but at that point, I really missed my parents. And I think in the place in Valmondois, I remember one little girlfriend who was also a survivor. In fact, she ended up in Montreal too with her parents and her sister. And I remember being friends with her, and so I sort of had someone, I think in that next school, which was somehow just on the outskirts of Paris, and maybe I just went there for the week and came back home. I don't remember anybody that I was, you know, sort of close to, not teacher and not child.
Were these secular schools, or were they run by the church?
No, I think they were secular. Yeah, there was no religion.
What did you do after school, while you were going to school in Paris?
I think there was a lot of homework, a lot of studying, a lot of that kind of thing. On the weekends, though, I remember we lived close to, I think it's called La Comédie Française, which was like a sort of big theater, like a Broadway type thing, and I was able to walk there. And my parents let me go, you know, by myself. I would have been less than 12. So I could go myself, and I saw plays by Molière, you know, that kind of thing. Like, I enjoyed that.
Did you receive any Jewish education at all during this time?
Not at that time.
Did you find, or did you make an attempt, did your parents make an attempt to connect with Jewish life at all in Paris?
I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I think it was a matter of survival, you know. My father had to learn how to earn some money. So did my mother. In fact, I don't even know where it sort of came from, unless what they were doing, which was like sewing in a factory. Or I think my father was able to, we had a sewing machine in the house, and he was able to get these, you know, by piece. Like, I think he put together pants, and so he would get like this huge package, and, you know, they would do it at home.
You don't know if any of these jobs came from the Jewish community?
I don't know. I don't know. But at that time, again, it was, we were not going to stay there and make a life there. So the associations with, you know, the religious affiliations and so on. But we did have relatives and friends, and again, my parents were quite hospitable, and I remember parties in this very small apartment that we had, but mattresses would go down, and these 3 second cousins, who I told you about, they're on Schindler's List, would very often sleep over, and there were card games, and there were, you know, so there was that kind of a little bit of a family feeling rather than an organized religious.
What was the name of these cousins that you said were on Schindler's List?
Yeah, one is, her married name is Paula Fishman, and she was Paula Grossbart, and my father's mother's name was a Grossbart, so that's how would be relation. The other one is, her name is Paula Brennes. That's her married name, and her maiden name was Hirschfeld, Paula Hirschfeld. And her brother is Milton Hirschfeld, and all three of those were on Schindler's List, and they worked in that Amalia factory, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And they ended up in the United States after France. They came here. We went to Montreal. But
When you met these relatives, did they talk to you at all about some of their experiences during the war?
they didn't talk to me about it, but they were conversations that were going on. First of all, they all had, you know, the tattoo at that time. I mean, they had got, you know, they got rid of it a little later on. So at these parties at home, there was talk of that. But I seem to remember, you know, the elation and the joviality more than the depression. And of course they would reminisce, and of course it was horrible, and everybody lost somebody. Nobody, you know, escaped. But the, you know, what I think was focused on was the going ahead from here, not the lingering on what was lost.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost their parents. One lost a brother. So
You told me that your father was being taught how to sew. He was
Right.
a sewing machine operator.
right,
But I don't remember if you told us what your mother did.
my mother did the same thing.
She did the same?
Yes,
I see.
did the same.
Okay.
And she was a little skilled in that. She,
Mhm.
you know, I told you, would sew for me and for Gabby. That was something she knew how to crochet and how to
Right.
knit. She was very creative. She knew how to do that. But my father had no clue about that.
Mhm. Mhm. So how long did you remain in Paris then?
3 years.
3 years. And when exactly did you leave? Do you remember the date?
Yeah, we went through the Riviera, through Nice. I don't know how long we stayed there, but we ended up in Halifax, Canada on January 17th, again on my birthday.
Hmm.
And from Halifax it was, I believe, maybe a 24-hour train ride to Montreal. And we came by boat on the Sobieski.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Sobieski. It was actually a Polish boat, but it left from Nice, from the Riviera.
And you say that your parents chose Canada because of this rabbi.
Yes, because he sent us the papers. You had to
Mhm.
be somehow sponsored.
Right.
You couldn't get into
And he was a relative, right?
He was a first cousin of
First
my mother's.
cousin.
Yes.
What did you take with you to Canada from Paris?
You know, this, actually, we're just thinking of that today, I think. We had very little because we were going to Palestine. So my mother packed up carpets. I think she even sent, we had a piano. She sent it to Palestine. And I said to my husband this morning, how come there were no pictures? Like, where's the rest of these pictures that were taken, you know? Because I think my mother sent everything to Palestine. And we never ended up there. And she had 2 sisters and a brother, but you can't ask them to go through your things. I think she said, sell the carpet, sell the piano. And what may have happened to individual, you know, items that were maybe dear to her, I don't know.
So you arrived in Canada with really...
Very little.
Very little.
Very little. But actually it was lucky that we arrived with little, because the first place where we lived, in fact we lived that way for several months, maybe even a year, we rented a room. We couldn't afford, you know. So my mother and father would have a bed in this room, and I would have a bed in that room too. I was 12 years old. We were living like that. I started going to school right away. Then when we, for whatever reason, either maybe the people who were renting us the room wanted a raise in rent, or maybe my parents wanted to move a little bit I don't think it was any bad area where we lived, but we moved a lot into another room. How did we move? We had our few belongings, and we arrived on January 17th, and if you know anything about Montreal, it's, you know, what did they say about Montreal? It's 5 months of winter and 7 months of snow, so, you know, like all year. We would take these couple of valises or these little trunks on a sled, and I would, you know, help my parents, you know, take the sled. There was, you know, to take a taxi or to take a moving van. There's just not money for that, and we would go from, you know, the first place we lived was on Park Avenue, which is not the Park Avenue of New York. And we would be at, let's say, 5962 Park Avenue, and then the next place would be 5323 Park Avenue. So, you know, for those couple of thousand houses, we would, you know, schlep the stuff on the sled, and we would, you know, end up there. And I think finally, before we had an apartment, we had maybe 2 rooms, so that I had a room and my parents had a room. But certainly for the first 1, 2, no, I think the first 2 places we lived, we only had 1 room. The next 2, we had 2 rooms, so that I had a room to myself. And then when I was 15, which would have been 3 years after 49, we could afford a little apartment. And my mother sewed curtains and bedspreads, and, you know. And my father became an insurance agent, and my mother remained with her work in the factory. She sewed dresses, and she did very well. She made quite a bit of money because she was good at it, and she was quick, and I think it was by the piece she was paid. And then my father went into construction. He had saved up a little money from the insurance and did very well.
What was that journey like from Nice to Halifax? Do you remember any of it?
Well, Nice to Halifax. I actually have a picture of my father on this boat. He of the 3 of us, I think, was, you know, quite with it. I remember being terribly seasick. I mean, just everything they say. It was a 14-day journey at that time. But Nice was like paradise, you know, and then we come to Montreal on January 17th, and it's the most dismal day of the winter. It's another storm. It's gray. It's cloudy. It's snowy, and you wonder what you've gotten yourself into. But you're with your parents, and you're free, and the next day is sunny, and...
Did you have any fantasies or any expectations about Canada before you arrived?
I'll tell you, I had a worry. You know, Montreal is, Quebec is the province that Montreal is in, and Quebec is basically a French province, which means that French is really, well, now certainly much more even than then. But at that time, it was bilingual, so it was French and English. And I begged my parents to allow me to go to a French school. I didn't want, you know, another change of the language. They may have, you know, in order to appease me, told me yes, but when this rabbi cousin showed up, it was an impossibility because the French schools were Catholic and the English schools were Protestant, and there was no way I was going to a French school. So, and of course, I needed to not be in a French school because the Protestant schools had the Jewish children, and that's who I became friends with, and, you know, but I just didn't want another, you know, another difficulty. I already settled in. I knew French, let me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I learned English pretty quickly.
So what was the name of the school that you attended when you were in Montreal?
A Fairmount School was the first school, and that was an elementary school. And I was 12, which means I should have been in 6th grade. But since I didn't get my wish of going to the French school, I said, at least let me, you know, put me in 5th grade, so I'm sure that, you know, I can sort of learn the language. And that was listened to. But very quickly I I did learn, and it was obvious that I could do the work because after the French school, the Canadian school was, you know, a piece of cake. I could do all the math, and yeah, that was much, much harder in Paris. So they moved me from 5th grade to 6th grade, so I was in the correct, you know. And then I went to 7th grade in the same school, in Fairmount School, and in Montreal, 7th grade is the last grade of the elementary school. Then there are 4 years of high school.
Can you recall where the school was located?
Oh yeah, it was on a street called Jean Mans. I remember that very, you know, from then on I started remembering somehow. Well, I was much older.
How did you get there?
How do I get to the school?
Yes.
I had to take, I was 12. I imagine I had to take a bus. I mean, we had no car, so nobody drove me. It was too far. At first, maybe I lived within walking distance. I think it was one of the houses that was, while I was at that school, I think I could walk. When I started high school, I had to go by bus, but that's how everybody went. Yes, I remember that.
Do you remember any of
So-
your teachers? Anyone
Yes, I
stand out?
remember a couple of teachers. There was one who was in my 6th grade. Her name was Miss Saltzman, and she knew about my Holocaust past, and she was sort of interested in me. I did quite nicely there, and she assigned another little girl who was a bright little girl. Her name was Evelyn something, to help me out, to, you know, sort of, I imagine I didn't speak English that well, so she was a big help to me.
Christine, we're going to stop for a
Sure.
moment. Thank you. This time. This is tape number 6, and I'm interviewing Christine Month. Christine, you were telling us about your arrival in Montreal and some of your reactions to living there and how you managed to adjust. And I'm sure you must have made some friends while you were there in Montreal. Do you recall any of them? Do you have any names?
Yes. In 7th grade, which would have been the 2nd year that I was in Montreal, I was in Miss Rourke's 7th grade class, and another little girl, Sarah Capito was her name. She had also been a survivor, and she survived, I believe, in Russia, but we were in the same class, and we became very, very close, fast friends, and over the years we've stayed in touch. But I remember that how were we treated? We were certainly treated quite nicely, but the teachers, of course, knew that we were, you know, survivors. And this teacher, Miss Rourke, had an expression for us that didn't bother me as much as it bothered Sarah, our 2 Polish little girls. And it very, very much bothered, you know, my friend. Just something that I happen to remember. After that, you know, when I went to high school, lots of, you know, friends, and back and forth to one another's houses, and really close friends. This was already a time when we were living in an apartment, so I could invite friends over, and, you know, social life of sorts began, as well as for my parents. My father was an insurance agent at the time, and he did quite well because he got all the newcomers. They didn't even know about insurance, and my father was able to sell it quite well. So always on the phone, always phone calls. The house often, you know, people would come over and so on. And I was more interested in, you know, my life, my social life. I probably began going out with boys. I remember my first date, the boy brought me home at 2. My father called him the next morning and gave him a terrible lecture, and I was very embarrassed. But after that, maybe we compromised, and I used to come in at 1, I don't know. And you know, I met my husband-to-be not much later than that. I think I was 19, and we married when I was 20. So.
What were the reactions like of some of your peers once they found out about some of your experiences?
Okay, I actually have a little story that goes back to my, it would be possibly my 6th grade or my 7th grade. There was one little girl who was very interested in me and I think felt very sorry for me. Now, I don't think I ever said very much, and as far as the way I looked and the way, you know, the kind of student I was, there was nothing to be, you know, pitied about me. And my mother made sure, as she did even during the war, that I was beautifully dressed. She sewed for me. She bought me, you know, quite lovely clothes. But I remember this little girl like invited me to her house, and with the best intentions, took me into the basement and gave me a bag of clothes. I think they must have been maybe even her mother's. And I don't think I really necessarily wanted this, but I'm the kind of person that doesn't like to, you know, hurt people's feelings. So I brought this stuff home, and my mother was, I don't think she was insulted, but like she couldn't understand it, and she so wanted me not to have taken it or to give it back, but that people didn't understand that, you know, we weren't in that kind of need, that I needed to wear her relatives' old clothes that were in the basement for the, you know, for the next shipment. But it was a, you know, it wasn't mean or anything. I can't remember if they wanted to know any specifics. I very much wanted to fit in and to belong, and it wasn't a thing, as I think you know and probably other survivors have told you, it was not something that we talked about. If we talked about it, we talked to family, to friends who had also survived, like with the Sarah, maybe we talked about these things. But we didn't want to be known for that, you know, that that's what we had been through. We wanted to assimilate, to belong, to fit in, to build a life, and that's basically what we did.
At this point, did you ever think about what you'd be when you grew up? What were your aspirations?
In high school, I think I wanted to be a social worker. I wanted to help a little, you know, I wanted to do that. Then I started going steady with a fellow who was still in school, and the idea was to go into teaching because there was a huge shortage of teachers in Montreal at the time. You could become a teacher in 1 year and sort of help support your mate. So maybe that's what got me into teaching. But I stayed with it and enjoyed it over the years and never gave much thought to would I have wanted better to be a social worker. But what I wanted more than anything else, and I think I said this already, was to get married and have children. That really was what I wanted. It wasn't a matter of being, you know, a doctor or a lawyer or a writer or, you know, the other was the thing that I wanted.
And why did you think this was such an important thing for you to do?
You know, I don't know. You mean, did it have something to do with my past? I remember lying in bed as a, you know, teenager and pretending that I'm talking to someone, like a husband, and he's talking to me, and we're, you know, discussing whatever. You know, these were the things that I was writing in my head. But that is, and you know, in the 50s, that's what most girls were interested in, so I wasn't different there.
Well, you said something about becoming a teacher, so I'm assuming that you went to college.
Yes.
Okay, where did you go?
Well, so I finished high school, and then I went to a teacher's college. No, I actually went to McGill University for 1 year, because that was before I met this fellow who I was going to marry and whom I needed to support, and I was probably thinking of social work. But then when I met him and we were actually going to be married, I went to a teacher's college. For 1 year I could get my teaching diploma, but I had already had 1 year of college, so it just meant like a bit of a higher salary than had I just gone from high school. And by then I had broken up with that young man and met my husband and married my husband, I think 6 months later. So I finished teacher's college and I got a job, and then I got my bachelor's degree at a college in Montreal called Sir George Williams University, and I got my degree at night, and I was working and going to school at night.
Did you ever move again?
Yes. So in 1964, my husband had gotten a PhD in physics, and he got a nice offer at the University of Illinois as a research assistant, and we left Montreal in 1964 and moved to Champaign-Urbana in Illinois. And by then I had 2 sons. First one was born in 1959. We married in 57. And then the other one was born in 1964 in Montreal, just before we left. And in 1964, when we moved to Champaign-Urbana, I had stopped working. I stopped working for 5 years. But we were there for 2 years. And then in 1966, we moved to New York. And in 69, I went back to work.
Why did you move to New York?
Because the research assistantship was only for a couple of years, and after that, my husband interviewed for a job at Brookhaven. There was, like in New York, a kind of, I don't know if they call it a fair or whatever, where you can find, who's looking for employees and so on. He's a physicist, and it seemed to be a good offer, and I kind of dreamed a little about New York, Champaign-Urbana, a small college town. I did not, I wanted more of a city life. So that's where we moved, and we've been here ever since.
Christine, did you ever file for restitution from the German government?
My father filed for me, and at that time, it was, I believe, in I don't know when this was started, maybe 53, but in 1956, I received like a lump sum of $1,200–1,400. But my father received a pension for life, and it was only ended when he died in 1996. There's an interesting story about that, because my mother had put in an application also, or perhaps my father had, filled out the application. And certainly if anybody deserved some restitution, it would have been my parents. I mean, the total wiping out of their whole families, and, what kinds of emotional traumas. But you had to go to the doctor, and you had to prove that you were nervous somehow. And my mother decided that she was not nervous, that she was not going to take money for whatever was done to her, and she refused it, and she never took a cent. And over the years, it was always a point of, was this a heroic act, or was this a stupid act? Mm-hmm. But I think heroic is where I'm at now.
You said you married in what year? What was the year you married?
1957.
And
June.
how did you meet your husband?
My husband needed a date for his niece was getting married, and I guess he used to go out not with Jewish girls, but for this family wedding, he needed to go out with a Jewish girl. And I was in somebody's little black book, and he got a Lily and a Molly and a Chris, and he kind of liked the Chris. So he called me to ask me out. And I don't think I was interested in going out with him. He sounded fine, but I wasn't, I had never been very successful with blind dates, and I just wasn't sort of interested. And he was supposed to call me back, I don't know, about a week later or something. And my mother, who knew quite a bit of what was going on, not necessarily finding it out from me by having me tell her, but, you know, eavesdropping a little here and there. I told her when Mel was supposed to call me that day that I was going to the library to study, and if somebody calls, just, you know, to say that I'm not home. I just, you know, was not interested in going out. But when he called, my mother told him exactly where I was. And so he came to the library, and when I met him, I realized that it was more than just a blind date, and we started going out, and we had a date on, no, I was going out with someone on New Year's Eve, so we decided to go out once before the wedding, this family wedding, and we went, I remember, to a hockey game, Canadians playing whoever, and the score was 1-0 at the end, and we had missed the first goal because I think he came late to get me. And after that, we went to that wedding, which was in February, and we got married in June.
As an adult, did anyone ever ask you about your experiences as a child?
Trying to think back to when we moved to Champaign-Urbana. This was in the mid-60s. I don't think anybody knew. When I moved here, and I've been teaching in Smithtown, this is my 29th year, other than close friends whom I worked with, nobody knew. Some people didn't really even know, you know, that I was Jewish. After Schindler's List, there was more of an interest, and I think maybe I mentioned to you that an ex-student of mine who was doing a report on the Holocaust had somehow remembered that I had mentioned that I was a survivor, not in his class, but a couple of years later when I had his sister in my class. And he called me and asked me if I would, you know, allow myself to be interviewed. He would just ask me some questions, and I said yes. And when he showed that tape in the high school, Ken Volk was interested because I was a primary source. So after that, I talked a couple of times at the high school, and more people know about it now. I showed the what I had written to my principal, and she very much wanted me to share it with my staff. I haven't yet, but I think maybe before I retire, which I'm planning to do this year, maybe I will.
So how long have you been teaching altogether, Christy?
29 plus 8, 37 years. I stopped for 5 years.
And you're presently teaching in?
Smithtown, a TACAN school in 4th grade.
Do you often think about your experiences as a young girl during the war?
I think about them much more now than I used to. And what does it have to do with, I sometimes ask myself. Maybe the fact that I turned 60 last year, the fact that I'm probably, you know, I was 2 years old when the war started. I'm one of the youngest people that, right, so the older people are gone already. But much more since I lost my parents, especially my father in 1996, because when he died, I realized that all those connections and all those questions I would not have answered, and I'd like to know. So I do think about it. I found among his papers a kind of primitive family tree, but it's something that I'm planning to, you know, look into and pursue to find out more about, you know, my own family. What was done to me or how I evolved. Of course, I think about it, but I can't say if this hadn't happened to me, I would be, a better person. Maybe I wouldn't be afraid to get on a plane. I can't know that for sure, so I don't blame that time for anything that, any way that I turned out.
You said you have 2 sons.
Yeah.
Tell me about them.
Steven is now 38. He's married. He has a little boy, Zachary, who's 1.5 years.
Your grandchild?
My grandchild, and his wife is pregnant again, and there'll be a little girl, hopefully, if all goes well, in February. Then I have Hal, who is 33. He's a musician. He's married. He lives in Atlanta. They're 5 years apart. As I told you, I always wanted to be married and have children, and I tremendously enjoyed bringing up these 2 boys. How you want to know anything about how my experiences may have related to,
Yes,
or
that
just
would be nice.
maybe they'll tell you some of that. They knew quite a bit about it especially the younger one was interested, and he tried to engage my father in some conversations and in some factual, details. At the time, I think my father was not either ready to talk, or maybe it was, a bit painful, but he claims that he found quite a bit out, but a lot, he didn't. I think they'll tell you, and maybe this is true, that perhaps I overprotected them a little bit, and maybe that had to do somehow with my, my fears, that certain of my fears originated in the Holocaust. So, like, I have some phobias, that's for sure. I'm afraid to fly. I'm terrified of flying. And maybe some of these things I passed on to them. They both fly. That's not a problem. But maybe there are, certain neuroses that I had that maybe they feel they have. To me, they seem perfectly normal, and I think I did a good job with them.
Do you think that your experiences during the war had any effect on your marriage?
I really don't think so. No, other than, this fear of abandonment, as I've explained it, I need to know where my husband is. I get worried. But, I've told that to some people, and they tell me they have these fears too, and they have not gone through the Holocaust, so I don't know.
Do you ever dream about your experiences?
I don't dream about my experiences, but I will tell you the recurrent nightmare that's like my nightmare, and, I'm sure that Freud would have other explanations, but it's this lost person. I'm somewhere, and I can't find my way to where I'm going, and I need to use the phone to get some help, but I don't have a coin, and I don't remember the number of my card, and every time I dial, I can't quite make it, and the phone doesn't work, and I can't find my car, and now I don't quite know where I am. And it's like that, the thing I told you about when I was tiny and I was sent on this errand in the ghetto. I'm not saying that's the dream, but that is my anxiety dream. I don't see Germans. I don't have violent, deaths in my dreams. Family, no.
Have you ever returned to Krakow?
No, and it's because of my fear of flying. And I have been invited so warmly by this Gabby who was here, who's still in the same house, and of course I would want to. do that, but I haven't.
Is there anything at all that you'd like to add to what you've already said about your experiences, Christine?
I think I pretty much covered it.
Why did you want to tell your story?
I've thought about that. Well, there are, a few reasons. I think it should be known, and people who have gone through it, who have been in it, who have felt it, who remember some of it, who have something to say, should tell it so that other people know that it happened. I did it maybe also because, I don't want to say I owe it, but it's something that wasn't there for my parents anymore to tell. And, I feel that it's their story also. And I don't know how my parents felt about their life, whether they felt they really accomplished great things. I mean, they were always thrilled that they had me and that they had the grandchildren. But they did accomplish something because they saw us through this horror. And other than, the luck that I'm sure played a part, it was their resourcefulness and their courage and their ability to not give up. I'm sure there were many people in my parents' situation who took their lives, who couldn't deal with it. But it's that puts me in front of this camera to be able to say it. And that's another reason why I'm telling it.
Okay, well, I thank you very much.
I thank you. Okay, this is my mother, Erna Margulies. It was taken in Poland. I'm not sure of the year. Before the war. This is my birth certificate. It was taken in Poland, and it's a copy, but this copy seems to be from 1945. This is my mother, Erna Margulies, and myself. It's taken in Poland, and it's definitely before the war, and I can't be more than 1 year, so maybe 1938. This is a picture of me, and it's taken in Poland, and I may be around 2 years old. It's before the war, so maybe 1938, 39. This is a picture of me. It's taken in Poland, and it was already during the war, so maybe 41, 40, something like that.
How old do you think you were here?
4, 3.5. What do you think? This is a picture of my mother's family. The first one on the left is Marta Hirschsprung. The next one is her sister Zosia Hirschsprung before she was married. Then it's my grandmother Leah Hirschsprung. Then is another aunt of mine, Riva Hirschsprung. Then it's my mother, Erna Hirschsprung. Then another sister of hers, Hannah. I don't know her married name. And then another sister, Dora. And on Hannah's lap, I believe, is her oldest daughter, whose name was Lala. And the little boy is either her son or, yes, it must be her son. And I don't know I don't remember his first name.
And where was this taken?
This was taken in Poland.
What year?
This would have been before the war, definitely. This is a picture of my father, Leon Margulies. I believe it was taken in Poland. I'm not sure of the year. This is a picture of myself and Gabi Zajączkowska, and it's taken in Poland, and probably 1942 or 43. This was taken in Poland, again, probably 1942, 1943. The woman on the right is Sofia Zajączkowska. I'm in the front. Behind me is Gabi Zajączkowska, and the woman, I don't remember her name, and her daughter were related to Gabi.
Sofia Zajączkowska was the woman who hid you.
That's right, and her daughter and her niece, I believe. This is me. It's taken in Poland, probably 43, 44. It could have been 44 already, in the place where my mother was hiding. This is me in St. Hippolyte, Canada, just outside of Montreal. I was 16, so it had to have been 1953.
This is tape number 7, and we're looking at photographs provided by Christine Month.
My mother is on the right, Erna Margulies. My father, Leon Margulies, is in the middle. I'm on the left. This was probably 1958, 1959 in Montreal, Canada. This is my wedding picture, June 23rd, 1957. Mel Month, my husband, and myself. It's my mother on the right, and I'm next to her. Our son, Steven, is in the front. Behind him is my father, and on the left is my husband, Mel. And it had to be before 1964, because Hal wasn't born yet. Maybe 62, 63. This was taken in Montreal in 1994. It's Gabi, who came to visit. She's on the left and I'm on the right. It was the first time I had seen her since the Holocaust. This is another picture taken in Montreal in 1994. My father is on the right, I'm next to him, Mel, my husband, and Gabi Zajączkowska on the left. It was taken in Montreal in 1994. This was my son Steven's wedding in 1986 in Rhode Island. In the back row on the right is my father. Next to him is Hal, our son, then Steven, our son, Joanne, his wife. I'm next to her. In the front, sitting down, is Mel, my husband, and on his right is my mother. That was 1986.
Hello, everybody. We're back. Christine, you have a beautiful family.
Thank you.
Especially this little one sitting on your lap. Would you please introduce us to your family, starting with the little one and moving to your left?
This is Zachary Month. He's Steven's son. He's 19 months. He's perfect. Mom. This is Mel, my husband. He's perfect too. Everybody's perfect. There's Joanne Month, Steven, my older son, and Hal.
Yeah. Well, it was nice for you to all get together today on behalf of Grandma and Mom. Is there anything that anyone would like to say to Christine, to your mom? Anyone have anything that they would like to mention right now? Something for posterity, perhaps?
You go first.
No, I like it.
Okay. My experience with the with the Holocaust and with the experience of the Holocaust obviously is very, very limited. I had interacted, of course, with my grandparents, and I would say that my grandmother, her recollections or her descriptions of the Holocaust were noticeable to me by their absence. It was noticeable to me that we heard very little about it from my grandmother, from my grandfather. There was more. He was more amenable to discussing it, but not, at least with me, in a very positive manner. I recall when I was a young teenager that he gave me the book Night by Elie Wiesel, and then I remember him staying with us and him having some nightmares just about that experience. With respect to our mother and the Holocaust, there was little discussion of it, and I think that's a testimony, of course, to her strength. She did not cause us to live with the overhang of that experience, but undoubtedly she raised us with the appreciation for life that only that kind of an experience can bring. So we thank you for that.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
I just, of course, wanted to thank you too. And basically, it's very easy to make you laugh, and I appreciate that gift because I'm happiest when I'm laughing. And that's basically what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Hal. Yeah.
Oh,
Mr.
I have
Nunn.
to say something. Actually, Chris stole my line. She said that we were all perfect, but actually she's the perfect one here. And I can only, she's a poet and obviously a beauty, and I wanted to say that I want to thank the heavens, actually, for taking her through the flames and through the night and bringing her to me.
Okay, well, I want to thank Leon and Erna, because without them, Christine would not be here. And without Christine, you would not be here. So on behalf of the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, I want to thank all of you, including Zach. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you again.